Sometimes the most profound transformations happen when we strip away everything we thought we needed. David Hartwell was drowning in the endless noise of city life. Deadlines, traffic, concrete walls closing in around him every day. At 52, he felt like he was sleepwalking through an existence that had lost all meaning. Then one morning, he packed a single backpack and walked away from it all. Deep in the Oregon wilderness, he found something the city had stolen from him: silence. What began as a desperate escape became something extraordinary. With his own hands, he built a stone cabin from the forest floor. He learned to grow his own food, to read the seasons, to find peace in the rhythm of simple work. But what happened when the outside world finally discovered his hidden sanctuary? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm screamed at 5:30, same as every morning for the past 12 years. David Hartwell's hand found the snooze button through muscle memory, his eyes still sealed shut against another day that felt identical to the one before. The corporate ID badge on his nightstand caught the gray light filtering through his apartment's single window, a plastic rectangle that had become his prison pass, granting him access to a life he no longer recognized as his own. His apartment sat on the 14th floor of a converted warehouse in downtown Portland, all exposed brick and industrial fixtures that the real estate agent had called authentic urban living. What she hadn't mentioned was how the neighbor's television bled through the thin walls, how the elevator groaned like a dying animal, or how the view consisted entirely of other people's windows, other people's lives playing out in squares of yellow light. David pulled himself upright, his knees protesting the movement. When had his body become so heavy, so reluctant? He shuffled to the bathroom, avoiding his reflection in the mirror above the sink. The man who stared back at him these mornings was a stranger, grey stubble, hollow eyes, skin that looked like it hadn't seen real sunlight in years, which he supposed it hadn't. The coffee maker gurgled to life, another sound in the symphony of mechanical noises that had replaced bird songs and wind through trees. He dressed in the same rotation of grey suits, each one hanging in his closet like the shed skin of the person he used to be. The person who had once spent weekends hiking the Cascade Mountains, who had known the names of wildflowers and could navigate by the stars. That version of himself felt like a story someone else had told him. A dream half remembered upon waking. The commute to Brennan and Associates Marketing was 23 minutes of stop-and-go traffic, radio voices selling products to solve problems he hadn't known he had. The drivers sat trapped in their own metal boxes, faces lit blue by phone screens, everyone rushing towards something they didn't want to reach. David had memorized every billboard, every street sign, every crack in the pavement along this route. His life had become a series of predetermined paths, worn smooth by repetition. His office occupied a corner of the 32nd floor, which should have felt like an achievement. Instead, the floor-to-ceiling windows offered him a panoramic view of concrete and steel stretching to the horizon, broken only by the occasional tree struggling to survive in a sidewalk planter. He had a photograph tucked behind his computer monitor, himself at 28, grinning beside a tent in the Three Sisters wilderness, mountains reflected in a pristine lake behind him. The young man in that picture had calloused hands and laugh lines, a face open to possibility. Now his hands were soft from years of typing, his face set in permanent lines of worry and resignation. "Morning, David." Sarah from accounting paused by his cubicle, coffee in hand. "Big presentation today, right?" He nodded, though he couldn't remember what they were presenting or why it mattered. Everything blended together. Campaigns for products that solved problems invented by other campaigns. Messages designed to make people feel incomplete, without things they'd lived perfectly well without for thousands of years. The presentation went as they always did. Charts showing marginal improvements in click-through rates, discussions about brand awareness and market penetration, words that meant nothing to anyone, but created the illusion of progress. David watched his colleagues nod seriously, take notes, ask questions about demographics and conversion metrics. When had he stopped understanding the language of his own profession? During lunch, he walked to Pioneer Courthouse Square, the only place downtown where he could see sky between the buildings. Office workers hurried past, everyone staring at phone screens, everyone connected to everything except the world around them. He sat on a concrete bench and watched pigeons pick through discarded food, marveling at how even these city birds seemed more alive than he felt. The afternoon dissolved into emails and conference calls, meetings about meetings, deadlines for projects that would be forgotten by next quarter. At 6:30, he was still at his desk when the cleaning crew arrived, pushing their carts through the maze of cubicles. The night janitor nodded at him, one of the few genuine human interactions he'd had all day. The drive home took 42 minutes in evening traffic. He stopped at the grocery store for a frozen dinner and a bottle of wine, stood in line behind a young mother wrestling with a toddler who wanted everything on the candy rack. The child's laughter was the first real sound he'd heard all day, unfiltered joy that made his chest ache with something he couldn't name. Back in his apartment, David sat in his single chair and stared out at the city lights. Somewhere beyond all this concrete and steel, mountains waited under star-filled skies. Somewhere, the wind still moved through old-growth forests and streams ran clear over granite stones. Somewhere, life happened at the speed of seasons instead of quarterly reports. The worn hiking boots in his closet called to him from the darkness, patient as the mountains they had once climbed. The brass compass lay heavy in David's palm, its needle trembling before settling true north. His father had carried this instrument through 23 years of forest service, navigating wilderness areas that existed now only in David's childhood memories. The old man's calloused fingers had traced these same worn edges, had trusted this needle when visibility dropped to nothing in mountain storms. A man who knows where he's going doesn't need much else, his father had said the day he passed it down. David had been 25 then, already 3 years into his corporate career, already feeling the pull of security over adventure. The compass had sat in a drawer ever since, forgotten beneath insurance papers and tax documents. This morning felt different. David dressed carefully in his best suit, knotted his tie with deliberate precision. If this was to be his last day at Brennan and Associates, he would leave with dignity and tact. The compass went into his jacket pocket, its weight a comfort against his ribs. The office buzzed with its usual Tuesday energy. Keyboards clicking, printers humming, the coffee machine working overtime. David moved through it all like a ghost, observing colleagues he'd worked beside for years without ever really knowing them. Janet at reception always wore the same shade of red lipstick. Marcus from Creative Services tapped his pen against his desk when thinking. Small details he'd never noticed, suddenly sharp and clear. "You're quiet today," observed Linda Chen, sliding into the chair across from his desk. As senior account manager, she'd been his closest work friend, if workplace proximity could be called friendship. They'd shared thousands of lunches, complained about clients over coffee, celebrated promotions with after-work drinks. Yet David realized he knew almost nothing about her life beyond these walls. "Just thinking," he said, logging into his computer for what might be the final time. "About the Reynolds campaign? I know it's been a nightmare, but we'll figure it out. The Reynolds campaign. 3 months of his life spent crafting messages to convince people they needed a new kind of breakfast cereal. The absurdity of it struck him with sudden clarity. Grown adults sitting in conference rooms, debating the emotional resonance of cartoon mascots and sugar content disclaimers. "Linda," he said carefully, "do you ever wonder what we're really doing here?" She laughed, the practiced laugh of someone deflecting an uncomfortable question. "Having an existential crisis, Hartwell. Must be a Tuesday." He spent the morning methodically organizing his files, password-protecting documents he'd created over 12 years of employment. His computer desktop held dozens of folders, campaigns for products he could barely remember, presentations that had once seemed vital, strategies for reaching demographics that existed only in spreadsheets. digital artifacts of a career spent convincing people to want things they didn't need. The desk drawers yielded their own archaeology. Business cards from colleagues who'd moved on to other companies, other lives. A coffee-stained notebook filled with meeting notes that meant nothing now. A small cactus Janet had given him for his birthday 3 years ago, somehow still alive despite his neglect. At noon, instead of joining the usual lunch crowd, David walked 6 blocks to Pioneer Place and bought camping supplies. A lightweight tent, sleeping bag, water purification tablets, freeze-dried meals. The outdoor store clerk, a kid with sun-bleached hair and rope-calloused hands, eyed David's suit with obvious confusion. "Heading somewhere special?" the kid asked. "I hope so," David replied. Back at the office, he drafted his resignation letter on company letterhead. The words came easily once he started. Gratitude for opportunities, appreciation for colleagues, standard phrases that meant nothing and everything. He sealed it in an envelope, wrote his supervisor's name across the front in careful script. Then he deleted it from his computer and dropped the envelope in his briefcase unopened. The afternoon crawled by in meetings about quarterly projections and brand positioning. David nodded at appropriate moments, made notes he'd never reference, watched the clock hands move toward 5:30. His colleagues discussed weekend plans, dinner reservations, shopping trips, television shows they were following. Lives measured in small entertainments, brief escapes from the routine that consumed their weeks. At 6 o'clock, the office emptied except for the usual suspects. Ambitious junior associates hoping to impress, workaholics with nothing better to do. People like David, who'd forgotten what home meant. He cleared his desk methodically, personal items fitting easily into a single cardboard box. 12 years of corporate life reduced to a few photographs and a dying plant. The security guard wished him good night, the same farewell exchanged 5 days a week for over a decade. David walked to the parking garage, set the box in his trunk next to the camping gear. The compass needle pointed steadily north as he drove home through traffic that seemed heavier, more oppressive than usual. In his apartment, he spread his father's old topographical maps across the kitchen table. The Oregon Cascades revealed themselves in careful contour lines, blue threads marking streams, green patches indicating wilderness areas. His finger traced possible routes, found remote valleys where a man could disappear if he chose to. The compass sat beside the maps, patient as stone, waiting to guide him toward something he couldn't yet name, but desperately needed to find. The hand-drawn trail map spread across David's steering wheel showed pencil marks where no official trails existed, sketched from memory and topographical study. He'd spent 3 nights refining it, cross-referencing old forestry reports and satellite images, plotting a route that would take him far from established hiking paths and campgrounds. The paper edges were soft from handling, the lines dark where he'd traced them multiple times, committing every elevation change and water source to memory. 4:30 in the morning, and Portland slept around him as he loaded the last of his gear into the SUV. The camping equipment filled the cargo area. Tent, sleeping bag, cook stove, enough food for 2 weeks if he was careful. Everything else he owned remained in the apartment. Artifacts of a life he was abandoning as deliberately as a snake shedding skin. The freeway stretched empty before his headlights, broken center lines marking his passage east toward the Cascade Mountains. Behind him, the city's glow faded to nothing. Ahead, darkness waited, not the artificial darkness of urban nights, but the deep black of places where human lights had never reached. 2 hours of driving brought him to the last gas station before Wilderness, a weathered building that served early morning loggers and weekend adventurers. The attendant, a gray-haired woman with coffee-stained fingers, barely looked up from her paperback novel as David filled his tank and bought batteries for his flashlight. "Heading up into the mountains?" she asked, making conversation. "Something like that," David replied. The gravel road beyond the station wound through second-growth forest, Douglas firs towering on both sides like cathedral columns. His SUV climbed steadily, leaving behind the last scattered houses, the final cell phone towers. The trail map guided him to increasingly remote logging roads, many unmarked on official maps, following pathways that existed primarily in the memories of old-timers who'd worked these forests decades ago. At the end of a rutted track that tested his vehicle's suspension, David found the trailhead he'd identified, nothing more than a gap in the tree line, marked by surveyor's tape that had faded to translucent gray. He parked the SUV beneath a stand of old-growth cedar, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't wrap their arms around them. The silence struck him first. After years of constant urban noise, traffic, sirens, air conditioners, neighbors, the forest's quiet felt almost solid, a presence that pressed against his eardrums. Then the sounds began to separate, wind moving through branches high overhead, the distant call of a bird he couldn't identify, water running somewhere beyond the trees. David shouldered his pack, feeling the weight settle against his spine. 48 pounds of gear and food, everything he needed to survive in wilderness. His hiking boots, broken in during weekend trips he'd taken in better times, found purchase on the narrow trail that wound upward through stands of hemlock and western red cedar. The first mile climbed steeply, his legs remembering the rhythm of mountain hiking. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool morning air. His breathing came hard at first, city lungs adjusting to clean air and physical demand. But his body remembered this work, muscles waking from their suburban sleep. The trail map proved accurate as he navigated by compass bearing and landmark, following ridge lines and creek beds marked in careful pencil strokes. A dead snag shaped like a pointing finger, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear. Reference points he'd identified from aerial photographs, now confirmed by tired feet and burning legs. By noon, he'd left the maintained trail entirely, following deer paths and game trails that wound through valleys most humans never saw. The map showed his destination, a remote cirque high in the mountains, accessible only by bushwhacking through unmarked terrain. A place where satellite images revealed a small lake, open meadows, and enough water and timber to support someone willing to work for survival. The ascent grew brutal in the afternoon heat. David's pack straps cut into his shoulders. His water bottles grew light too quickly. But with each step, something loosened in his chest, a tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The corporate world fell away behind him with each switchback, each mile gained in elevation. Late afternoon brought him to a ridge overlooking the valley he'd chosen. Below lay a perfect bowl, carved by glaciers 10,000 years ago, a hidden sanctuary surrounded by granite peaks. A stream wandered through its center, feeding a lake that reflected the sky like polished silver. Meadows spread between groves of lodgepole pine and along the stream's banks. He could see rich soil, where water had deposited decades of mountain sediment. David consulted his map one final time, confirming the route down into the valley. According to his research, this place existed in a legal gray area, too remote for regular patrol, too small for commercial interest, forgotten by all but the mountain goats and deer that had always called it home. The trail down proved treacherous, loose scree that threatened to send him tumbling with each step. But as the sun touched the western peaks, David reached the valley floor and stood in grass that came up to his knees. The silence here felt different from the trail above, not empty, but full of potential. He pitched his tent beside the stream, hands remembering the motions from camping trips, taken in what felt like another lifetime. The water ran clear and cold, tasting of snowmelt and stone. As darkness settled over the mountains, stars emerged in numbers he'd forgotten existed. The Milky Way, stretching across the sky like a river of light. The first stone David lifted from the creek bed weighed nearly 30 pounds, its surface worn smooth by decades of mountain water. Gray granite shot through with veins of quartz. It felt solid and permanent in his hands, the kind of rock that could anchor a foundation, support the weight of walls, endure whatever weather the mountains might bring. He carried it up the gentle slope from the stream to a level spot beneath a stand of Douglas fir. where morning sun would warm the ground, but afternoon shade would provide relief. This was supposed to be a 2-week retreat. Time to clear his head, gain perspective, maybe decide what to do with the rest of his life. The plan had been simple: camp, hike, think things through, then return to civilization with renewed purpose. Find a different job, perhaps. Move to a smaller city. Make changes that felt manageable, reasonable. But as David set the stone on the earth and stepped back to examine its placement, something shifted inside him. The rock looked right there, as if it had always belonged in that exact spot. The surrounding trees seemed to nod approval in the morning breeze. The stream's constant murmur sounded like encouragement. He had awakened that morning to silence so complete it felt like a physical presence. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk riding thermals above the valley. His tent had felt like a cocoon, protecting him from nothing more threatening than dew and starlight. For the first time in years, he had slept 8 hours without waking. No middle-of-the-night anxiety about presentations or deadlines. No lying awake calculating mortgage payments and retirement contributions. His body had simply surrendered to exhaustion and found in that surrender something approaching peace. The morning coffee, brewed over his camp stove with stream water, tasted better than anything from the espresso shops he'd frequented in Portland. The simple act of lighting the stove, measuring grounds, waiting for water to boil. Each step had felt deliberate, meaningful in a way that pushing buttons on an office coffee machine never had. As he explored the valley in widening circles from his campsite, David discovered resources that made his heart race with possibility. A grove of dead-standing timber, perfect for construction. Clay deposits near the lake that could be shaped into vessels. Wild berries growing in sunny clearings, their fruit still weeks from ripening, but promising future abundance. The stream provided everything he needed: clean water, power for a potential mill wheel, fertile soil deposited along its banks where vegetables might grow. Fish moved in the deeper pools, their shadows flickering over stones worn smooth by countless seasons of snowmelt and rain. But it was the stone that convinced him. Not just this first foundation rock, but the abundance of building material scattered throughout the valley. The creek had carried them down from the peaks above, sorting them by size and shape over geological time. Some flat enough for walls, others rounded for decoration. All of them free for the taking by anyone willing to do the work. David spent the afternoon walking the valley's perimeter, GPS unit marking coordinates, compass confirming orientations. The place existed in a pocket of public land, too remote for development, too small for commercial interest. Legal questions might arise eventually, but for now it remained unclaimed, unnoticed. Unknown except to the deer that had worn paths between the meadows and the bears that had left claw marks on the bark of ancient trees. As evening approached, he returned to the foundation stone he'd placed that morning. It looked even more natural now, as if the earth had shifted slightly to accommodate its weight. He imagined walls rising from this corner, rooms taking shape, windows framing views of lake and forest and sky. His cell phone had shown no signal since leaving the highway. He could hike back to the road, drive to town, call his sister to explain his extended absence, make arrangements to return to Portland, clear out his apartment, handle the practical details of a life abandoned. The responsible thing to do. Instead, David pulled the phone from his pack and powered it down. Then, after a moment's hesitation, he removed the battery and dropped both pieces into the stream. They disappeared beneath the surface without ceremony, claimed by water that would carry them eventually to the Columbia River, then to the Pacific Ocean, then to places beyond imagining. The decision felt as natural as breathing. This valley had been waiting for him, perhaps for years. The stone had been waiting too, patient as mountains, ready to become the foundation of something he couldn't yet envision but trusted completely. Tomorrow he would begin building. Tonight he would sleep under stars that had never seen a city. in silence deeper than any he'd known since childhood, surrounded by possibilities as endless as the forest that stretched beyond the valley's rim. The resignation letter lay beside his camp stove, 3 paragraphs of carefully chosen words that would never reach their intended recipient. David had written it on hotel stationery during his last night in Portland, formal language expressing gratitude for 12 years of employment while providing 2 weeks' notice he had no intention of serving. The paper felt strange now between his fingers, like an artifact from someone else's life. He held the letter over the small flame, watching the corner catch fire. The words disappeared in curls of smoke. Thank you for the opportunity. Effective immediately. Personal reasons requiring relocation. Corporate language designed to say nothing while appearing to explain everything. The flames consumed his careful politeness, his professional courtesy, his last gesture toward a world that no longer held any claim on him, the ashes scattered on the morning breeze, grey specks that settled among the pine needles and dissolved into the forest floor. In 2 weeks, when he failed to appear at his desk, someone would notice. His supervisor would make phone calls that went unanswered, send emails to an account David would never check again. They would worry, perhaps, then irritated, then move on. Someone else would inherit his accounts, his office, his small corner of the corporate machine. By then, he would be officially missing. His sister would call the police after a week of unreturned messages. They would find his SUV eventually, parked legally on Forest Service land with camping gear missing from the back. A hiker who wandered off and never returned. It happened more often than people realized in wilderness, this vast and unforgiving. David pulled his credit cards from his wallet. Plastic rectangles that connected him to bank accounts and payment systems. Digital tentacles reaching back to the civilization he'd abandoned. His driver's license bore a photograph taken 3 years ago. A clean-shaven man in a business suit who bore only superficial resemblance to the bearded figure he was becoming. One by one, he fed them to the flames, until nothing remained but melted plastic and metallic strips that would never again grant him access to the modern world. The destruction felt ceremonial, necessary. Each card that curled and blackened in the fire severed another connection to David Hartwell, marketing executive, resident of apartment 14C, owner of vehicle registration number XKY7892. That man was disappearing as surely as smoke rising into the mountain air, becoming memory and speculation rather than verifiable fact. His first attempts at hunting proved humbling failures. The deer he tracked through morning mist seemed to anticipate his movements, vanishing into timber before he could draw a clear shot with the rifle he'd purchased but barely knew how to use. His fishing efforts yielded only frustration. Tangled lines, lost lures, hours spent casting into pools that held no fish or fish too clever for his clumsy technique. Hunger gnawed at him by the 3rd day. His freeze-dried supplies wouldn't last forever, and he'd counted on supplementing them with fresh game and fish. The reality of wilderness survival struck him with increasing urgency as his stomach cramped and his energy flagged. This wasn't a weekend camping trip with a restaurant waiting at the trail's end, but foraging proved more successful. Wild onions grew in the meadow near the lake, their sharp flavor a welcome addition to his dwindling supplies. Huckleberries clustered on bushes in sunny clearings, small explosions of sweetness that reminded him why food had once been about more than convenience. Rose hips hung red and heavy on thorny canes, packed with vitamins that would sustain him through the coming months. He learned to identify edible plants from childhood memories of hiking with his father, knowledge buried beneath decades of urban living, but still accessible when desperation sharpened his attention. Dandelion greens, bitter but nutritious. Wild mint growing beside the stream. Mushrooms he recognized from field guides, though he moved cautiously here, aware that a single mistake could end his experiment in self-sufficiency permanently. The nights brought different challenges. Without city lights, darkness fell complete and absolute, broken only by stars so numerous they seemed to vibrate against the black sky. Sounds that had never penetrated his urban consciousness now demanded interpretation. The crack of a branch that might indicate a bear passing nearby, the splash in the lake that could be fish jumping or something larger drinking at the water's edge. Fear visited him in these moments, cold and sharp as the mountain air. What if he'd made a terrible mistake? What if the romantic notion of wilderness living proved impossible without skills he'd never developed, knowledge he'd never acquired? What if this valley became his tomb rather than his salvation? But morning always returned, bringing with it renewed determination and the simple fact that retreat was no longer possible. He had burned those bridges as surely as he'd burned his credit cards, reducing his options to a single choice: learn to live here or die trying. The makeshift hammer felt awkward in David's hands. A river stone lashed to a straight piece of oak with strips of leather cut from his old belt. He'd spent 2 days crafting it, testing different weights and handle lengths until he found a combination that felt balanced, purposeful. The tool was crude compared to anything he could have bought in Portland, but it was his creation, shaped by necessity and limited only by his ingenuity. Building had always been theoretical for him, something other people did while he paid them for the results. Now, faced with the reality of raising walls from nothing but scattered stones and determination, he discovered how little he actually knew about the fundamental act of construction. His first attempts at laying a foundation produced crooked lines and unstable corners that would never support the weight of walls. The morning sun revealed his failures with harsh clarity. Stones he'd thought perfectly fitted showed gaps wide enough for his fingers. Corners that had seemed square proved dramatically askew when measured with lengths of rope. His beautiful foundation stone, carried so ceremoniously from the creek, sat cockeyed in a bed of smaller rocks that shifted whenever he stepped near them. David dismantled his first week's work without ceremony, stacking the stones nearby for reuse. The labor felt different this time, less like construction and more like archaeology in reverse, taking apart what he'd created to understand why it had failed. Each stone taught him something about weight distribution, about the patient art of finding surfaces that would mate properly, about the difference between building for appearance and building to last. His hands bore the evidence of his education. Blisters had formed and broken and formed again, leaving calluses that reminded him of his father's palms. His fingernails were permanently stained with dirt and stone dust. Cuts from sharp granite edges had healed into tiny scars that mapped. His growing competence with materials that didn't forgive carelessness. The leather strips that bound his hammerhead were salvaged from boots that had given up their soles to the rough terrain. His pants, torn beyond repair on blackberry thorns, became rope when cut into strips and twisted together. Every possession was transitioning from its intended purpose to whatever use his circumstances demanded. The process felt liberating, freedom from the tyranny of things designed for single purposes, locked into narrow definitions of utility. By the second week, his foundation began to take recognizable shape. The stones seemed to fit together more naturally, finding their proper relationships without the forcing and shimming that had characterized his earlier efforts. He developed an eye for matching surfaces, for identifying which rocks would bear weight and which would crumble under pressure. The creek provided an endless supply of building material, but selecting the right stones required skills he was still developing. Too heavy, and he couldn't move them alone. Too light, and they wouldn't anchor properly in the wall. Too rounded, and they wouldn't stack. Too angular, and they created pressure points that would eventually crack under load. He learned to read stone the way his father had read weather. Subtle signs that revealed structural integrity, stress patterns invisible to untrained eyes. A hairline crack might indicate weakness, but it might also show where a stone would split cleanly when struck with his makeshift chisel. Mineral veins could strengthen or weaken, depending on their composition and orientation. The work consumed him completely. He rose with the sun and labored until darkness made precise placement impossible, then studied his progress by firelight, planning the next day's efforts. His world narrowed to the immediate problems at hand. Which stone came next? How to level an uneven course, where to position corners that would remain true under the weight of future walls. Physical exhaustion replaced the mental fatigue that had plagued him in Portland. His body ached in new ways, muscles protesting the constant lifting and carrying and precise positioning of heavy objects. But this tiredness felt clean, honest, earned through productive effort rather than accumulated through stress and frustration. His primitive tools multiplied as necessity demanded them. A flat stone became an anvil for shaping metal salvaged from his camping gear. Straight branches, stripped and hardened in the fire, served as pry bars for moving rocks too heavy to lift. Sharp flakes of flint, knapped using techniques half-remembered from childhood museum visits, created cutting edges that sliced through leather and rope with surprising efficiency. Each tool represented a small victory over circumstance, proof that human ingenuity could overcome material limitations. The hammer that had felt so crude in his first attempts now seemed perfectly balanced for its intended work. His hands had adapted to its weight and swing, muscle memory developing through repetition until the motion felt natural, inevitable. By month's end, his foundation stretched 12 feet by 16, level within tolerances his eye could judge, and strong enough to bear his full weight as he walked its perimeter. The accomplishment felt enormous, not just because of the physical labor involved, but because it represented knowledge gained through direct experience rather than theoretical study. Standing on his foundation as evening settled over the valley, David felt a satisfaction deeper than any promotion or bonus had ever provided. These stones would remain in place long after he was gone, a testament to the possibility of building something lasting with nothing but patient effort and stubborn determination. The small leather pouch had once held tobacco for his father's pipe, soft doeskin worn smooth by decades of handling. Now it cradled seeds David had gathered throughout the valley, wild strawberry, huckleberry, and dandelion from the meadows, pine nuts from the ancient trees, even the hard black seeds of wild roses that might, with patience and proper care, grow into hedges that could feed him in years to come. Each seed represented possibility, faith in a future he was still learning to imagine. Some he'd collected from plants he'd eaten, understanding now the cycle that connected consumption with cultivation. Others came from species he'd identified, but not yet tasted, insurance against the inevitable failures that would mark his first attempts at mountain agriculture. The work of gathering had taught him to see the valley with different eyes. What had once appeared as random wilderness now revealed itself as a complex system of relationships, plants that grew in specific microclimates, animals that followed, seasonal patterns, water that moved through the landscape in predictable ways that determined where life could flourish and where it struggled to survive. September brought the first hard frost, silver crystals that transformed his meadow into a landscape of crystalline beauty that vanished with the sunrise. The cold shocked him awake in his tent, reminding him that summer's abundance was temporary. That winter would test every skill he'd learned and reveal gaps in his preparation that could prove fatal. His stone walls had risen 3 feet above the foundation, progress measured in aching muscles and calloused hands rather than calendar days. The structure was beginning to look like shelter rather than archaeological ruins, corners that met at honest right angles, courses that ran level and true. But 3 feet of wall would not keep out mountain winter, and his tent would offer no protection against snow loads that could collapse its lightweight frame. The urgency of approaching winter drove him to work longer days, rising before dawn to take advantage of every hour of workable light. His hands moved with increasing confidence now, selecting stones that would fit together naturally, understanding the patient art of building something meant to last. Each course added weight and stability to those below, the structure becoming more solid as it grew. But walls alone would not create livable space. He needed timber for roof beams, materials for chinking the gaps between stones, some solution for the crucial problem of keeping water from penetrating his living space. The forest offered resources, but harvesting them required tools he didn't possess and skills he was still developing through trial and costly error. His diet had simplified to what the valley provided: fish from the lake when he could catch them, wild vegetables and berries carefully gathered and stored for the lean months ahead. Occasionally, small game, rabbits and grouse he'd learned to snare using techniques gleaned from half-remembered survival manuals and desperate improvisation. The work was changing his body in ways that surprised him. His soft office physique was disappearing, replaced by lean muscle built through constant physical labor. His hands, once smooth from years of keyboard work, now bore permanent stains from stone dust and pine sap. His face had weathered to leather brown, lined from squinting against mountain sun and wind. More importantly, his relationship with time was transforming. In Portland, days had blurred together in a haze of artificial urgency. Meetings that could have been emails, deadlines that existed only to create more deadlines, a pace of life that left no room for reflection or genuine accomplishment. Here, time moved at the speed of seasons, measured in the gradual accumulation of knowledge and the slow progress of walls rising stone by stone. He'd started a journal, writing by firelight in a notebook salvaged from his former life. The entries tracked practical matters: which plants fruited when, where animals came to drink, how weather patterns moved through the valley. But between the practical observations, deeper thoughts emerged, reflections on what it meant to build something with his own hands, to live at the mercy of weather and season, to find satisfaction in work that served no master but his own survival. The seed pouch accompanied him on every foray into the valley, growing heavier as autumn progressed. He learned to identify plants by their seeds rather than their flowers, understanding that next year's abundance depended on this year's careful observation and collection. Some seeds required specific conditions: cold stratification through winter, scarification to break tough hulls, precise timing for spring planting. Winter would be a teacher unlike any he'd faced. His partially completed cabin would test his building skills against snow loads and wind that could find every weakness in his construction. His food stores would measure the adequacy of his gathering and preservation efforts. His mental resilience would face the challenge of isolation and darkness that could last for months. But tonight, with his seed collection complete and his walls nearly ready for roof beams, David felt prepared in ways that transcended mere physical preparation. He'd found something in this valley that the city had never offered: a sense of purpose that came from work directly connected to survival, satisfaction that grew from creating rather than consuming, peace that emerged from accepting his place in cycles larger than any individual ambition. The hand-carved roof beam stretched 12 feet from wall to wall, hewn from a Douglas fir that had fallen in some long-ago storm. David had spent 3 weeks shaping it with primitive tools, his makeshift adze chipping away bark and sapwood until the heartwood emerged, dense and straight-grained, capable of bearing the weight of roof and snow for decades to come. His initials were carved into one end, along with the date, though he'd had to calculate what month. It was by counting back from his arrival in late summer. The beam represented more than structural necessity. It was proof that he could create something both functional and lasting, with nothing but patience and determination. Every surface bore the marks of his learning curve, the gouges and uneven cuts that showed where his technique had evolved from clumsy hacking to controlled, purposeful strokes. By the time he'd finished, his hands moved the tools with confidence born of repetition, muscle memory replacing conscious thought. Installing the beam required engineering solutions that would have challenged a full construction crew. With no crane or assistance, David had to devise ways to lift 200 pounds of timber 8 feet off the ground and position it precisely between stone walls that left no margin for error. He'd built an elaborate system of ramps and pulleys using rope salvaged from his camping gear and pulleys fashioned from wood and strips of leather. The day he finally wrestled the beam into place marked a turning point in his construction project. With the main support installed, the cabin's skeleton began to take recognizable shape. Secondary beams followed more easily, each one teaching him better techniques for measurement and installation. The structure gained integrity with each addition, becoming something more than the sum of its stones and timber. But the real revelation came the first night he slept inside walls rather than fabric. His tent had protected him from rain and wind, but the cabin offered something qualitatively different, a sense of permanence, of belonging to this place rather than merely camping in it. The stone walls radiated warmth they'd absorbed during the day, moderating the temperature swings that had made sleep fitful in his lightweight shelter. The roof itself demanded different skills than the walls below. Laying shingles split from cedar logs required precision in cutting and careful attention to water-shedding patterns. Each piece had to overlap its neighbor perfectly, creating a surface that would turn aside the heavy snows that would soon test his workmanship. The splitting process wasted more wood than it used, his early attempts producing kindling rather than roofing material. His technique improved through failure and observation. The wood taught him how to read its grain, to find the natural lines where it wanted to split rather than forcing cuts against its structure. Cedar worked differently than the Douglas fir he'd used for framing, softer, more forgiving, but also more likely to tear if handled improperly. Each species had its own personality, its own requirements for successful use. Inside the completed shell, David created furniture that served multiple functions. A table that could fold against the wall when space was needed for other activities. Benches with storage compartments built into their bases. A bed frame that doubled as additional storage. Raised high enough that supplies could be stored underneath. Safe from moisture and pests. The construction process had taught him to think differently about possessions and space. Every object had to justify its presence through utility. There was no room for decoration that served no practical purpose, no storage for items that might someday prove useful. This constraint felt liberating rather than limiting, freeing him from the accumulation that had cluttered his apartment and, he now realized, his thoughts. His hands had become different instruments during the building process. Where once they'd been soft tools for manipulating keyboards and steering wheels, they'd transformed into calloused implements capable of precise work with rough materials. The scars and permanent stains told stories of lessons learned through direct contact with unforgiving substances, stone that crushed fingertips, wood that left splinters, metal that cut when handled carelessly. The completed cabin measured 12 by 16 feet, small by any suburban standard, but spacious compared to the tent that had sheltered him through his first months in the valley. More importantly, it represented security in a way that his Portland apartment never had. This structure belonged to him, not through monthly payments to a distant landlord, but through the labor of his own hands. The knowledge embedded in every joint and corner. Standing in his doorway as evening light faded over the lake, David felt a satisfaction that went beyond mere accomplishment. The cabin existed because he'd willed it into being, shaped it from raw materials through patient effort guided by necessity and imagination. No committee had approved its design, no inspector had certified its construction, no mortgage company held claim to its value. The first snow would test his workmanship, but he'd built with winter in mind. The roof pitch would shed snow rather than accumulating dangerous loads. The stone walls would store heat from his fireplace and release it slowly through cold nights. The raised foundation would keep moisture from penetrating his living space. Tonight, for the first time since leaving Portland, David would sleep in a house, not a tent or temporary shelter, but a permanent structure that marked his transition from visitor to resident, from refugee to homesteader. The beam above his head bore his mark, testament to the possibility of creating home through will and work alone. The irrigation channel stone lay perfectly level, its flat surface allowing water to flow in a steady, controlled stream from the mountain creek to David's nascent garden plot. He'd spent days selecting this particular piece of granite, testing its dimensions and slope until the water moved at exactly the right speed, fast enough to prevent stagnation, slow enough to allow absorption into the soil below. The engineering was primitive but effective. Gravity and careful placement doing the work that pumps and pipes accomplished in the civilized world. Spring had arrived with dramatic suddenness, snowmelt swelling the creek to twice its winter volume, while the first green shoots pushed through soil that had been frozen solid for months. David's seed collection, carefully stored through the dark season, now represented possibility transformed into action. Each variety required different conditions, different timing, knowledge he was acquiring through experimentation and inevitable failure. The garden plot stretched 30 feet along the creek's bank, where centuries of flooding had deposited rich alluvial soil perfect for cultivation. David had cleared it stone by stone, root by root, creating raised beds that would drain properly during the wet months while retaining moisture through summer drought. The work had taken weeks, but the resulting tilth felt like silk between his fingers, dark, organic earth that promised abundance if he could provide the right combination of seeds, water, and attention. His irrigation system grew more sophisticated as he understood the relationship between water and terrain. Secondary channels carried overflow to different sections of the garden, each one regulated by simple dams made from flat stones that could be adjusted to direct flow where it was needed most. The system required daily monitoring, constant small adjustments as water levels changed with weather and season. But the garden demanded more than engineering solutions. Plants needed specific nutrients, protection from pests, careful timing of planting and harvest. David's first attempts at cultivation revealed gaps in his knowledge that no amount of physical labor could compensate for. Seeds that rotted in soil too wet for germination, seedlings that withered when transplanted too early, crops that grew vigorously but produced nothing edible due to poor soil, preparation or inadequate pollination. Each failure taught him something valuable about the complex relationships that supported agricultural success. Soil wasn't just dirt, it was a living ecosystem of bacteria, fungi, and countless microscopic organisms that broke down organic matter into forms plants could absorb. Composting became as important as irrigation. Kitchen scraps and forest litter transformed through time and decomposition into black gold that made everything grow more vigorously. His first successful harvest was modest, a handful of radishes that had somehow survived his inexpert care, their sharp bite a celebration of possibility realized. The potatoes he'd planted in carefully mounded rows showed more promise, their green tops indicating extensive root development below ground. Beans climbed poles he'd cut from the forest, their nitrogen-fixing roots improving soil that would support future crops. The work connected him to rhythms older than civilization. He rose with the sun to check his irrigation channels, spent mornings weeding and tending, used afternoon heat for construction projects that winter had postponed. Evening brought harvest of whatever was ready, wild greens, early vegetables, herbs that added flavor to his simple meals. His diet was transforming along with his garden. Fresh vegetables replaced the preserved foods that had sustained him through winter, their crisp textures and bright flavors a welcome contrast to smoked fish and dried berries. He learned to eat seasonally by necessity, understanding for the first time why traditional cuisines celebrated spring greens and summer fruits with such enthusiasm. The irrigation stone became a focal point for daily ritual. Each morning, David would adjust its position slightly, monitoring water flow and making small corrections that kept his garden properly watered. The stone was beautiful in its functionality, Grey granite shot through with pink feldspar. Worn smooth by the creek's constant passage, but strong enough to channel water exactly where his plants needed it. Water management was teaching him to think like a watershed. Rain that fell on the peaks above would reach his garden in days or weeks, filtered through soil and rock, carrying dissolved minerals that nourished his crops. Drought meant adjusting his irrigation strategy, perhaps sacrificing some plants to ensure others survived. Flood required quick action to protect vulnerable seedlings from erosion. The success of his agricultural efforts would determine whether he could truly sustain himself in this valley long term. Wild foods provided important supplements, but reliable calories required cultivation of crops that would store well and provide energy through winter months. Potatoes, beans, squash, the foundations of subsistence farming that had fed mountain communities for generations. But beyond mere survival, the garden was teaching him patience and observation in ways that his corporate career never had. Plants grew according to their own schedules, responding to temperature and moisture in patterns that couldn't be rushed or forced. Success required working with natural systems rather than imposing artificial timelines. Accepting that some years would be abundant while others tested his ability to adapt and endure. Standing knee-deep in growing plants as evening light slanted across the valley, David felt connected to something larger than individual effort. This food would nourish him through another year, but more importantly, it represented proof that human beings could live in harmony with natural systems when they took time to understand and respect the ancient relationships that sustained all life. The carved wooden deer stood barely 3 inches tall, its form simplified but unmistakably graceful. Antlers suggested by careful cuts that caught morning light streaming through David's cabin window. He'd whittled it from a piece of mountain ash during long winter evenings, fingers working by firelight while snow hissed against his roof. The figure captured something essential about the doe that visited his garden each dawn: her alertness, the way she held her head when listening for danger, the delicate strength that allowed her to survive in country that tested every living thing. She'd appeared first as a shadow at the forest edge, drawn perhaps by the scent of growing vegetables, or simply curious about the changes human presence had brought to her territory. David had named her Grace, though he kept the name to himself, understanding that attachment to wild creatures often led to disappointment or worse. Still, her morning visits had become the highlight of his days, a connection to the animal world that felt like acceptance of his presence in this ancient valley. The relationship had required patience and careful boundaries. David's initial attempts at approach had sent her bounding away, whitetail flashing warning to other deer that might be watching from cover. He learned to move slowly when she was present, to avoid direct eye contact that predators used to intimidate prey, to keep his voice low and his gestures minimal. Trust developed incrementally, measured in reduced flight distances and longer visits to his garden. Other animals had proven more challenging. A young black bear had discovered his compost pile, returning night after night despite David's efforts at deterrence. The bear meant no harm. It was simply following its nose to an easy food source, but its presence created constant tension. David couldn't afford to lose his precious food stores to a creature that could eat a week's worth of provisions in a single visit. The solution required understanding bear behavior rather than fighting it. David moved his compost farther from the cabin, buried food scraps deeper, and hung anything edible from ropes strung between tall trees. The bear adapted to these changes, but gradually lost interest as easier food sources became available elsewhere in the valley. Their relationship settled into wary coexistence, each respecting the other's need for space and resources. Ravens had proven the most intelligent neighbors, their complex social dynamics playing out in the airspace above David's clearing. They watched his activities with obvious interest, calling to each other in what seemed like commentary on his building projects and gardening efforts. When he cleaned fish, they waited at respectful distances for scraps, learning his routines and timing their arrivals accordingly. One raven, distinguished by a missing toe on its left foot, had grown particularly bold. David called him Hodge, after a character in a half-remembered novel, and found himself talking to the bird during solitary work. Hodge seemed to listen, cocking his head and offering occasional croaks that David chose to interpret as conversation. The bird's intelligence was unmistakable. He could solve simple puzzles David created for entertainment, learned to mimic sounds from around the valley, and demonstrated problem-solving abilities that often surprised his human neighbor. The carved deer wasn't David's only artistic attempt. A small menagerie had grown on his mantelpiece, a raven with outstretched wings, a bear rearing on hind legs, a trout curved as if leaping from water. Each figure represented hours of patient work, wood shavings curling away from sharp knives as he learned to see the animal hidden within the grain. The carving process itself was meditative, requiring attention to detail that left no room for the anxious thoughts that had once plagued his city evenings. Working with his hands in this way connected him to traditions that stretched back thousands of years. Indigenous peoples had lived in valleys like this one, creating art that celebrated their relationships with animal neighbors. David felt humble recognition of their knowledge, their understanding of seasonal patterns and animal behavior that had sustained communities for generations before European contact disrupted those ancient ways of life. His observations of valley wildlife were teaching him lessons that no nature documentary could convey. Animals here lived by rules more complex than simple survival. Social hierarchies, territorial agreements, seasonal migrations that followed patterns invisible to casual observation. The deer that visited his garden was part of a larger herd that moved through the valley according to food availability and weather patterns. The bears maintained individual territories, but gathered peacefully when salmon runs brought temporary abundance to shared fishing spots. Winter had tested every creature in the valley, not just David. He'd found deer browsing on bark when snow covered their preferred browse, watched ravens cache food in hidden locations for lean times, observed how different species adapted their behavior to survive months of scarcity. Their resilience inspired his own efforts at preparation and conservation. Now, as spring brought renewal to the valley, animal activity was increasing dramatically. Birdsong filled the air as migrant species returned from winter refuges. Marmots emerged from hibernation, their whistles echoing from rocky slopes. The stream ran thick with spawning fish, attracting predators and scavengers in numbers David had never seen during his first year of residence. The carved deer on his mantelpiece reminded him daily that he was not alone in this place, that survival required understanding and respecting the complex web of relationships that connected all valley residents. The leather-bound journal lay open on David's rough-hewn table, its pages filled with careful observations written in fading ink he'd made from elderberries and iron-rich creek water. 2 years of entries chronicled his transformation from desperate refugee to competent homesteader, each page recording lessons learned through trial and error, failure, and small victories. Weather patterns, animal behavior, plant growth cycles, construction techniques, knowledge accumulated drop by drop like water wearing channels through stone. Tonight's entry reflected on the profound shift in his relationship with time itself. In Portland, minutes had felt precious and scarce, hoarded against an endless list of obligations that expanded faster than he could complete them. Here, time moved at the pace of seasons, measured not in quarterly reports, but in the slow accumulation of firewood, the patient tending of vegetables, the gradual weathering of stone walls that would outlast their builder. He'd written extensively about the psychology of solitude, observations that surprised him with their clarity. The first months had brought a silence so complete it felt oppressive, the absence of human voices creating an echo chamber where every doubt and fear amplified beyond proportion. But gradually, that silence had filled with subtler sounds, wind patterns that predicted weather changes, bird calls that indicated the presence of predators. The minute creaks and settlings of his cabin as temperature fluctuated. Loneliness had been the hardest enemy to overcome, more challenging than winter cold or food shortages. There were days when he'd spoken aloud to his carved animals simply to hear a human voice, even his own. He'd caught himself preparing meals for two, setting imaginary places at his table for companions who existed only in memory. The human need for social connection had proved deeper than hunger, more persistent than fatigue. But solitude had also brought gifts he'd never expected. Without the constant noise of other people's opinions and expectations, his own thoughts had clarified like creek water settling in a still pool. He'd rediscovered interests buried beneath decades of career focus, astronomy, which the valley's dark skies revealed in stunning detail. Botany, learned through necessity but growing into genuine fascination. Philosophy, pondered during long evenings when physical work was done and mental energy sought outlet. His journal recorded the gradual shift from thinking about his old life to thinking within his new one. References to Portland became less frequent, then disappeared entirely except when comparing his current contentment to past anxiety. The corporate world that had once consumed his identity now seemed like something he'd read about rather than lived. A cautionary tale about the dangers of losing oneself in artificial urgency. Physical changes had paralleled mental transformation. His body, soft from years of desk work, had hardened into something approaching his father's lean competence. Hands that had known only keyboards now shaped wood with instinctive understanding of grain and stress. Eyes accustomed to screen glare had learned to read weather in cloud formations, to identify plants by leaf shape and growing pattern, to spot animal movement at distances that would have escaped his urban attention. But the deepest changes were philosophical. The consumer mindset that had driven his city existence, always wanting more, better, newer, had gradually been replaced by appreciation for enough. His small cabin provided adequate shelter. His garden produced sufficient food. His possessions, each one essential and well-maintained, represented security rather than status. He'd written pages about the relationship between ownership and freedom, observations that would have seemed absurd to his former self. In Portland, he'd owned a car, apartment, furniture, electronics, clothes for every occasion. Hundreds of objects that required maintenance, insurance, replacement, storage. Yet he'd felt constantly insecure, worried about losing what he had or failing to acquire what he wanted. Here, with possessions that fit in a single room, he felt wealthier than any salary had ever made him. His cabin was his because he'd built it, not because he'd made payments to distant institutions. His food was his because he'd grown it, not because he'd traded hours of life for money to purchase it. The distinction seemed fundamental, a different relationship with the material world that created abundance from simplicity. Weather prediction had become his most practical skill, developed through careful observation and painful mistakes. Subtle changes in air pressure, wind direction, cloud formation, patterns invisible to someone who lived in climate-controlled environments, but crucial for anyone whose shelter and food supply depended on understanding natural cycles. His journal contained detailed notes on these relationships, knowledge that could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe. The current season brought its own challenges and rewards. Spring meant fresh food, but also mud season, when trails became impassable and even short trips required planning. It meant planting time, with all the anxiety of gambling limited seed supplies on weather predictions and soil conditions. It meant the return of migratory animals and the beginning of construction projects postponed through winter. But spring also brought confirmation that his systems worked, that he'd learned enough to thrive rather than merely survive. His cabin had weathered another winter without significant damage. His food stores had lasted with some to spare. His water and sanitation systems functioned reliably. He'd achieved something approaching mastery of this small corner of wilderness, Writing by lamplight, as rain drummed against his roof, David felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought him here. The man who'd fled Portland would not recognize the person he'd become. Calmer, stronger, more connected to fundamental rhythms that civilization had obscured but never eliminated. His journal would bear witness to this transformation, a record of one man's return to essential human ways of living. The emergency medical kit had been one of David's wisest purchases during his final supply run in Portland, though he'd hoped never to need it for anything more serious than minor cuts and scrapes. Now the compact red bag lay open beside a young man who'd stumbled into his clearing at dawn, left leg bent at an angle that spoke clearly of fracture, face pale with shock and pain. The hiker couldn't have been more than 25, with the lean build of someone who spent serious time on mountain trails. But even experienced hikers could fall victim to a moment's inattention on treacherous terrain. "Please," the young man gasped as David knelt beside him. "I think it's broken. I've been crawling for hours trying to find help." David's hands moved with steady purpose through the medical kit, muscle memory from wilderness first aid courses taken years ago, returning under pressure. The fracture was clean, no bone protruding through skin, but the leg needed immobilization before any attempt at movement. He'd practiced these techniques on weekend camping trips that now seemed like preparation for this moment, though he'd never imagined applying them as a hermit, living beyond the reach of emergency services. "What's your name?" David asked, partly to assess the hiker's mental state, partly to fill the silence while he worked. Jake Morrison. I was hiking the Cascade Trail, trying to reach Alpine Lake, but I took a wrong turn somewhere. Got turned around and kept walking, hoping to find the main trail." The young man's voice carried the educated cadence of someone from the city, probably Seattle based on his gear choices. "Then I slipped on wet rock crossing a stream. Stupid mistake." David fashioned a splint from straight branches and strips of cloth torn from his own shirt, trying to remember the proper technique for immobilizing a lower leg fracture. Too tight and he'd cut off circulation. Too loose, and the broken bone would shift during transport, potentially causing more damage. The work required delicate balance between providing support and maintaining blood flow to the extremity. "How did you find me?" David asked as he worked. The location of his homestead was deliberately remote, invisible from any established trail, hidden in a valley that appeared on few maps and attracted no casual visitors. "Saw smoke from your chimney yesterday evening. Figured someone might be camping up here. Didn't expect to find a whole cabin." Jake's eyes moved around the clearing, taking in the stone walls, the garden plots, the obvious signs of permanent habitation. "You live here? Like actually live here?" The question carried layers of amazement that David recognized from his own early days in the valley. The idea of choosing deliberate isolation, of building shelter with hand tools, of growing food and living without electricity or running water, it challenged assumptions about what constituted reasonable human existence in the 21st century. 2 years now," David replied, checking the circulation in Jake's toes. "Good color, normal temperature?" The splint would hold until they could get him to professional medical care, but that presented its own complications. The nearest hospital was 60 miles away, by roads that David's memory mapped imperfectly. His old SUV sat rusted beyond repair near the forest edge, abandoned after his second winter when a tree had fallen across its hood. 2 years? Jake's voice climbed an octave. "By yourself? How do you get supplies? Food, medical care?" David finished securing the splint and sat back on his heels, considering how to answer questions that revealed the vast gap between his current existence and the assumptions that governed most people's lives. How to explain that supplies came from the forest and garden, that medical care meant prevention and careful living, that the need for constant acquisition had simply evaporated once basic needs were consistently met. "I make do," he said finally, "but right now we need to focus on getting you help. Can you describe where you left the main trail? How long ago?" Jake's account of his route revealed he'd been lost for nearly 2 days. wandering in, gradually expanding circles as panic overcame navigation skills. He'd been following game trails rather than human-made paths, drawn deeper into wilderness by his growing desperation to find help. His water was nearly gone, his food exhausted. His emergency whistle lost during the fall that broke his leg. The irony wasn't lost on David. This young man's crisis had brought the outside world crashing back into his carefully constructed sanctuary. For 2 years, he'd lived in deliberate isolation, avoiding human contact, existing as if civilization had forgotten his existence. Now someone's life depended on his ability to reconnect, however briefly, with systems he'd abandoned. But as he helped Jake into a more comfortable position and prepared hot soup over his wood stove, David felt no resentment, only the automatic response to human need that transcended his chosen solitude. The smartphone lay face up on David's table like a piece of alien technology, its black screen reflecting the lamplight in ways that seemed almost malevolent. Jake had insisted on keeping it with him during the rescue, claiming it contained important contacts and medical information, though its battery had died hours before the search team arrived. Now plugged into a portable charger one of the rescuers had provided, it glowed with dozens of notifications that represented David's worst fears made manifest. The rescue itself had unfolded with military precision. Jake's emergency beacon, activated once they'd hiked close enough to the main trail for satellite coverage, had brought a helicopter within 3 hours. The crew had been professional, efficient, focused entirely on patient care rather than the unusual circumstances of Jake's discovery. They'd asked few questions about David's presence in such remote territory, treating him as just another good Samaritan who'd happened to be in the right place at the right time. But Jake had been anything but discreet during his treatment and evacuation. Pain medication had loosened his tongue, and he'd regaled his rescuers with enthusiastic descriptions of the amazing hermit guy who'd built an entire homestead in the middle of nowhere. Details spilled out between morphine-induced gaps, the stone cabin, the garden, the incredible self-sufficiency of someone who'd apparently been living off-grid for years without anyone. Knowing he existed, David had watched the rescuers' expressions shift from professional detachment to growing interest as Jake's story unfolded. These were experienced mountain rescue volunteers, people who thought they knew every inhabited corner of the wilderness they protected. The idea of a completely unknown resident living in territory they'd patrolled for years clearly intrigued them in ways that promised future complications. The smartphone contained photographic evidence that Jake had captured while David was preparing his evacuation kit. Images of the cabin exterior, the garden plots, even candid shots of David working around his homestead, all taken with the casual assumption that sharing such things was normal, harmless, even admirable. The young man's Instagram account showed dozens of wilderness photos from his hiking adventures, each one tagged with location data and enthusiastic captions about outdoor discovery. Within hours of Jake's hospital admission, the photos were online. His account, followed by thousands of outdoor enthusiasts and adventure seekers, provided immediate distribution for images that transformed David's carefully guarded secret into viral content. The caption read, "Incredible! Found this guy living completely off-grid in the Cascades. Built his own cabin from stones, grows all his own food, hasn't seen civilization in years. Real-life mountain man living the dream. Off-grid, the wilderness life, the hermit, authentic, and inspiring." The responses came immediately. Comments expressing amazement, admiration, skepticism, and curiosity flooded Jake's post within minutes of publication. Outdoor influencers shared the images to their own accounts, adding commentary about authentic living and escape from modern pressures. Adventure blogs picked up the story, speculating about David's identity and location. YouTube personalities began planning expeditions to find the mysterious hermit's homestead. David stared at the screen with growing horror as his private world became public entertainment. The images showed every detail of his sanctuary, The cabin's exact construction, the garden layout, even the distinctive rock formations that would make the valley easily identifiable to anyone with basic map-reading skills. Jake had unknowingly created a treasure map for every adventure seeker, wannabe survivalist, and social media content creator on the West Coast. The comments revealed the gulf between his reality and public perception. People described his lifestyle as inspiring, authentic, the real American dream, completely missing the years of struggle, failure, and gradual skill development that had made survival possible. They saw romantic adventure, where he'd experienced desperate necessity, noble simplicity, where he'd found practical solutions to immediate problems. Worse, some comments included speculation about his location. Amateur cartographers were already analyzing background features in the photos, cross-referencing them with topographical maps and satellite imagery. Someone had created a Reddit thread dedicated to finding the Cascade Hermit, with participants sharing theories about valley access routes and landmark identification. By evening, the story had been picked up by local news outlets hungry for feel-good content about pandemic-era lifestyle changes. Television reporters were describing him as a symbol of freedom and self-reliance, a man who'd found peace by rejecting modern complexity. The irony was crushing. His attempt to escape public attention had made him more famous than any corporate achievement ever had. David powered down the smartphone and set it aside, but the damage was done. His hidden valley, his carefully constructed anonymity, his peace, all of it now existed in the public domain, transformed from private reality into shared fantasy. Tomorrow would bring the first visitors, he was certain. People seeking inspiration, adventure, or simply the validation that came from witnessing something they'd seen online. The silence that had once felt like sanctuary now seemed ominous, heavy with the approaching storm of unwanted attention that would test everything he'd built in this place. The crumpled news article bore the headline, "Modern Thoreau, Corporate Dropout Builds, Paradise in the Wilderness," its glossy pages torn and water-stained from David's furious handling. A hiker had left it weighted down with stones on his doorstep, part of the growing pile of offerings that appeared daily now. Energy bars, camping gear, handwritten notes from strangers who felt compelled to share their own dreams of escape from modern pressures. The article painted a romantic picture that bore little resemblance to David's actual experience. The reporter had never visited the valley, relying instead on Jake's viral photos and second-hand accounts from people who claimed to know details about the Cascade Hermit's lifestyle. Every paragraph reinforced myths that David found simultaneously flattering and infuriating. The notion that wilderness living was somehow spiritually pure, that self-sufficiency was simply a matter of wanting it badly enough, that anyone could walk away from civilization and find instant peace in the mountains. Visitors had begun appearing within days of the story breaking online. At first, they came individually, hikers who'd studied the background features in Jake's photos and managed to navigate the unmarked trails that led to David's valley. They approached his cabin with the reverent excitement of pilgrims visiting a shrine, eager to meet the man who'd achieved what they could only fantasize about during their weekend camping trips. David tried to be gracious with these early visitors, understanding their curiosity while maintaining firm boundaries about privacy and disruption to his routine. Most were respectful, content to see the cabin and garden from a distance, to ask a few questions about solar panels and water systems, to take their own photos for social media documentation of their successful pilgrimage. But the trickle of individual visitors had quickly become a flood of groups, families, even organized tours led by guides who'd capitalized on the viral interest. Instagram influencers arrived with professional camera equipment, staging elaborate photo shoots against the backdrop of David's homestead. YouTube personalities filmed detailed walkthroughs of his property, narrating tours for audiences who consumed wilderness living as entertainment rather than lifestyle choice. The environmental impact was immediate and devastating. Trails that David had carefully maintained for his own use became highways worn raw by hundreds of boots. Visitors left trash despite his requests for pack-it-in, pack-it-out principles. Someone had carved initials into his garden fence. Others had attempted to collect souvenirs, stones from his cabin walls, vegetables from his garden, even wood shavings from his workshop. The media attention had attracted offers that revealed how completely the outside world misunderstood his motivations. Publishers wanted to buy his wilderness survival story. Reality television producers proposed documenting his lifestyle for mass consumption. Corporate sponsors offered to provide gear and supplies in exchange for product placement in his authentic off-grid environment. Most disturbing were the entrepreneurs who'd begun selling Cascade Hermit merchandise without his permission or knowledge. T-shirts bearing slogans about authentic living, camping gear marketed as Hermit approved, even guided tours that promised to recreate his experience for urbanites seeking weekend enlightenment. His voluntary poverty had become a brand. His rejection of materialism transformed into a marketing opportunity. The news article quoted experts who analyzed his psychological motivations, speculating about trauma or mental illness that might drive someone to such extreme isolation. Sociologists discussed his story as evidence of millennial disillusionment with traditional career paths. Environmentalists claimed him as a symbol of sustainable living, while libertarians saw him as proof that government regulations were unnecessary for people willing to take responsibility for their own welfare. None of these interpretations reflected David's actual experience or motivations, but they'd taken on lives of their own in the echo chamber of social media and cable news commentary. He'd become a symbol rather than a person, a projection screen for other people's anxieties and fantasies about modern life. The constant stream of visitors was making normal life impossible. His morning routine of checking irrigation channels and tending the garden now required scheduling around tourist schedules. Evening reflection time was interrupted by the flash of cameras and the chatter of groups camping illegally on the valley's periphery. Even basic privacy, bathing in the stream, using his outdoor privy, was compromised by the possibility of unexpected observers. Worse, the attention was attracting less benign visitors. Someone had attempted to break into his cabin while he was away gathering firewood. Others had tried to establish their own camps in the valley, claiming squatters' rights to public land, despite his years of prior residence. A group of drunk college students had left beer cans floating in his pristine lake, treating his sanctuary like a remote party destination. The irony was crushing. His escape from modern life's pressures had made him more famous than any corporate achievement ever could. The peace he'd found through isolation was being destroyed by people seeking to experience that same peace second-hand. His rejection of materialistic culture had been commodified into products and experiences that generated profit for others while providing him nothing but headaches. Standing in his garden at dawn, watching a family of 4 set up their tent on the opposite shore of his lake without permission, David faced a realization that felt like physical pain. The valley that had saved his sanity was being loved to death by people who understood neither its fragility nor the years of careful stewardship required to maintain its balance. Something had to change, but every option felt like surrender to forces beyond his control. The hand-painted "No Trespassing" sign stood crooked against a Douglas fir, its red letters already fading from a week of mountain weather. David had crafted it in desperation, using paint salvaged from an abandoned supply cache and a piece of plywood someone had left behind after an illegal camping expedition. The sign felt like a surrender, acknowledgement that his hidden valley was no longer truly hidden, that the sanctuary he'd built through years of careful stewardship now required protection from the very people who claimed to admire what he'd accomplished. The legal research, had taken him 3 trips to the nearest town, each journey a painful re-entry into the civilized world he'd abandoned. The public library's computers felt alien beneath his calloused fingers as he navigated government websites and property databases, trying to understand his tenuous claim to land he'd thought of as home for nearly 3 years. The results were discouraging, but not entirely surprising. His valley existed within a national forest, technically public land, managed by agencies that had never heard of David Hartwell or his stone cabin. Squatters' rights, he discovered, were more complex than frontier mythology suggested. His improvements to the land, the cabin, garden, irrigation system, might establish some legal standing, but only if he could prove continuous residence and demonstrate that his presence enhanced rather than degraded the property's value. The process would require lawyers he couldn't afford, documentation he'd deliberately avoided creating, and exposure to bureaucratic scrutiny that threatened the privacy he'd fought so hard to maintain. Meanwhile, the invasion continued with increasing boldness. Groups arrived daily now, some following GPS coordinates posted on social media, others guided by entrepreneurs who'd created unofficial tours of the Hermit Valley. They treated his property like a public park, taking photos of his cabin, sampling vegetables from his garden, even attempting to enter his home when they found it unlocked during his morning fishing trips. The environmental damage was accelerating beyond his ability to repair. Foot traffic had killed the delicate alpine plants that had taken decades to establish along the lake's shore. Someone had attempted to build an unauthorized fire ring using stones from his carefully constructed retaining walls. Toilet paper flowers bloomed around the valley's perimeter, where visitors ignored basic wilderness sanitation principles. Worse, other squatters were attempting to establish their own claims to pieces of his valley. A group of young adults had set up a permanent camp on the eastern meadow, claiming they were following David's example by rejecting mainstream society. Their presence brought noise, trash, and constant demand for his attention and advice. They seemed to believe that wilderness living was simply a matter of pitching tents and waiting for nature to provide, showing no understanding of the years of skill development and careful preparation that made subsistence possible. David had tried reasoning with the various groups, explaining the valley's fragility and requesting minimal impact behavior. Some visitors listened respectfully and modified their actions accordingly. But others saw his requests as selfish attempts to monopolize public resources, arguing that he had no more right to the valley than anyone else who chose to camp there. The legal complications multiplied as his story gained national attention. Environmental groups had taken interest in his case, some supporting his right to remain, while others argued that any permanent human habitation damaged wilderness ecosystems. Government agencies faced pressure to address the situation, either by evicting all unauthorized residents or by establishing formal regulations that would inevitably change the valley's character. A Forest Service ranger had visited the previous week, a polite young woman who seemed genuinely conflicted about her mission. She documented his improvements with photographs and GPS coordinates, noting both the quality of his construction and the obvious care he'd taken to minimize environmental impact. Her report would contribute to some bureaucratic decision-making process that would determine his future without necessarily considering his wishes or the valley's best interests. The ranger had also brought news that chilled him. Other government agencies were taking interest in his situation. The IRS wanted to know about unreported income from his media appearances, despite his having given no interviews and authorized no commercial use of his story. The state health department questioned whether his water and sanitation systems met current standards. Immigration officials somehow suspected he might be harboring undocumented persons in his remote location. Each agency operated according to its own bureaucratic logic, treating him as a problem to be solved rather than a person who'd found a sustainable way to live lightly on the land. Their forms and regulations assumed participation in systems he'd deliberately rejected: social security numbers, mailing addresses, income sources that could be documented and taxed. The no trespassing sign represented his growing desperation to preserve what remained of his sanctuary through increasingly futile gestures. He knew the sign carried no legal weight on public land, understood that it might actually attract more attention from people curious about what he was trying to protect. But it felt necessary anyway, a symbolic statement that this place meant something more than entertainment for weekend adventurers. Standing beside the crooked sign as evening light faded over his invaded valley, David faced the possibility that his experiment in wilderness living might be ending not through his own choice, but through the well-meaning destruction of people who wanted to experience what he'd created without understanding what that creation had required. The government eviction notice lay crisp and official on David's handmade table, its bureaucratic language a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wood and oil lamp that illuminated its contents. Federal agents had delivered it that morning with polite efficiency, their presence in his valley feeling as surreal as everything else that had followed Jake's viral photos. The document gave him 30 days to vacate the premises, remove all personal property, and restore the land to its original condition, an impossibility given that his stone cabin had become as much a part of the landscape as the granite outcroppings that surrounded it. Agent Sarah Martinez had been respectful during the service, even sympathetic to his situation, but firm about the legal realities he faced. The Forest Service had determined that his unauthorized structures violated federal regulations governing wilderness areas. Public pressure following his unwanted fame had forced their hand. They could no longer ignore a situation that had become a media spectacle and environmental concern. "We understand this is your home," she'd said, standing awkwardly in his doorway while her partner photographed the cabin's interior for official documentation. "But the law is clear about permanent structures on public land. The publicity has made it impossible to grant exceptions." The irony was bitter enough to taste. His attempt to live quietly and sustainably, leaving the smallest possible footprint on the land, had become legally untenable only after others had turned his story into entertainment. The valley that had absorbed his cabin without protest, where his garden enhanced rather than degraded the ecosystem, where his presence had harmed nothing and no one, was now considered damaged by his very existence. But the eviction notice had triggered an unexpected response from groups David had never imagined would take interest in his situation. Environmental lawyers from Portland had contacted him through intermediaries, offering to challenge the government's action pro bono. They argued that his sustainable lifestyle represented exactly the kind of human-land relationship that environmental regulations should protect rather than prohibit. Local tribal representatives had also reached out, sharing stories of their ancestors who'd lived in similar valleys for thousands of years before European contact had made such existence illegal. They offered cultural and legal support, arguing that indigenous peoples' rights to traditional lifeways should extend to anyone adopting genuinely sustainable practices. Even more surprising was support from property rights advocates who saw his case as government overreach, an example of bureaucratic inflexibility that criminalized self-sufficiency and voluntary simplicity. Strange bedfellows united by shared opposition to regulatory systems that seemed designed to prevent exactly the kind of responsible land stewardship David had practiced. The media attention that had destroyed his privacy was now working in his favor, generating public sympathy and political pressure that bureaucrats couldn't entirely ignore. Letters poured into congressional offices from people inspired by his story, demanding exceptions for citizens who chose to live lightly on public lands. Environmental groups staged protests outside federal buildings, carrying signs that read, "Protect sustainable living," and "Bureaucracy destroys what laws should preserve." David found himself caught between competing visions of his future, each group projecting their own agenda onto his situation. Environmental lawyers wanted to establish legal precedents for sustainable land use. Tribal representatives sought to reclaim traditional relationships with ancestral territories. Property rights advocates aimed to limit government power over individual choices. Politicians saw opportunities to demonstrate either environmental leadership or opposition to federal overreach. None of these agendas entirely matched his own desires, which remained fundamentally simple: to live quietly in the valley that had become his home, tending his garden and maintaining the cabin he'd built with his own hands. The legal battle they proposed would require him to become a public figure, to testify at hearings and submit to interviews, to transform his personal choice into a political statement. But the alternative was surrender, abandonment of everything he'd built and learned during 3 transformative years. The cabin would be demolished, his garden plowed under, his irrigation channels filled with stones. The valley would return to official wilderness status, protected from his benign presence while remaining vulnerable. To the weekend warriors whose illegal camping had caused far more environmental damage than his permanent residence ever had, Agent Martinez had left him with contact information for the lead attorney handling his case, a woman named Elena Vasquez, who specialized in environmental law and indigenous rights. The preliminary strategy involved challenging the Forest Service's authority to evict long-term residents who could demonstrate beneficial impact on land health, while simultaneously seeking congressional intervention to create exceptions for sustainable homesteading on appropriate public lands. The legal pathway was uncertain, expensive despite pro bono representation, and guaranteed to extend the unwanted publicity that had created his problems in the first place. Success would establish important precedents, but might also open his valley to managed tourism or educational programs that would forever change its character. Standing in his garden as evening settled over the contested landscape, David weighed options that all felt like compromise. Fight and risk losing anyway, while sacrificing the privacy that had made this life meaningful. Submit to eviction and lose everything he'd built while setting precedent that would discourage others from attempting similar experiments in sustainable living, or find a third path that honored both his need for meaningful work and society's apparent hunger for alternatives to destructive patterns of consumption and waste. The answer, when it came to him, felt as natural as the compass needle that had guided him to this valley 3 years ago. The visitor's logbook lay open on the rough-hewn table just inside David's cabin door, its pages filled with careful entries from the small groups he now welcomed to his valley each month. Names and dates recorded alongside thoughtful reflections on sustainable living, traditional skills, and the profound peace that came from understanding one's place in natural cycles. The leather-bound journal had become a record of transformation, not just his own, but that of the carefully selected individuals who came to learn what 3 years of wilderness living had taught him. The solution had emerged from months of negotiation between his legal team, Forest Service administrators, and congressional representatives who'd taken interest in his case. Rather than fight for the right to remain as a private resident, David had proposed something unprecedented: designation of his valley as an educational demonstration site for sustainable living practices, with himself as caretaker and instructor under a special use permit that recognized both his expertise and the unique value of his established homestead. The arrangement satisfied multiple constituencies while preserving what mattered most. Environmental groups celebrated the creation of a living laboratory for low-impact wilderness habitation. The Forest Service gained a model program that showcased responsible stewardship while generating positive publicity. Politicians could point to innovative solutions that balanced individual freedom with environmental protection. Most importantly, David could remain in his valley while sharing the knowledge he'd gained through years of patient experimentation. The program limited visitors to 12 people per month, selected through an application process that emphasized genuine interest in learning traditional skills rather than casual tourism. Participants stayed for week-long sessions, camping in designated areas while learning to build with stone and timber, grow food in challenging conditions, manage water and waste sustainably, and develop the patient observation skills that wilderness survival required. David discovered unexpected satisfaction in teaching, finding that explaining his techniques to others deepened his own understanding of principles he'd learned through trial and error. Students brought fresh perspectives that improved his methods while carrying away skills they could apply in their own communities. Many returned to urban environments with changed relationships to consumption, waste, and the natural systems that supported all human life. The cabin had been officially designated a historical structure, protected from demolition, while serving as an example of what humans could build using local materials and traditional techniques. His garden continued to demonstrate permaculture principles adapted to high-altitude conditions. The irrigation system became a teaching tool for gravity-fed water, management that required no external energy inputs, seasonal. Variations in the program ensured that students experienced the full cycle of mountain life. Spring sessions focused on planting and water management. Summer programs emphasized food preservation and construction techniques. Fall brought lessons in harvesting and winter preparation. Winter workshops, limited to the most committed students, taught the mental and physical skills necessary for surviving months of isolation and cold. David's own life had found new rhythm in this role. Solitude remained important, long stretches between student groups when the valley returned to its natural quiet. But the teaching periods brought human connection that enriched rather than depleted his energy. He found particular satisfaction in working with young people who arrived, skeptical of their ability to live, without modern conveniences, and left confident in skills their grandparents had taken for granted. The media attention had largely faded as his story became less novelty than established institution. Occasional articles appeared in outdoor magazines or educational journals, but the viral excitement had moved on to other subjects. His valley had returned to relative obscurity, known primarily to serious students of sustainable living rather than casual adventure seekers. Standing beside his cabin as another group of students departed, David felt deep satisfaction in what his experiment had become. The valley continued to provide everything he needed while serving a larger purpose that honored both his desire for meaningful work and society's need for practical alternatives to destructive patterns of consumption. His logbook would continue to fill with names and reflections from people who carried pieces of this place back to their own communities. Some would establish their own homesteads using skills learned here. Others would apply permaculture principles to urban gardens or renewable energy systems to suburban homes. All would understand that humans could live well within natural limits when they took time to learn the patient arts of observation, adaptation, and respect for the systems that sustained all life. The compass his father had given him still pointed true north, but David no longer needed its guidance. He had found his direction in this valley, in the work of teaching others that authentic wealth came not from accumulation, but from the deep satisfaction of living in harmony with the land that supported them all.